In June 1992, two judges on Australia's highest court wrote something that had never appeared in an Australian legal judgment before. They called the history of Australian settlement and colonisation, and I quote, a conflagration of oppression and conflict that left a national legacy of unutterable shame. That's a Supreme Court. That's the highest legal authority in the country, using that language on the record officially. The question is, what changed between the story Australia had told itself for 200 years and that sentence? The answer is a number, and the story of how that number got produced and what it broke when it did is what we're getting into. If you picked up the most widely used university history textbook in Australia in the 1960s, the one students across the country were assigned, and you looked up Aboriginal Australians in the index, you would find nothing. Not an entry, an entire continent's indigenous population, tens of thousands of years of civilization, and the violence of their dispossession reduced to nothing. This wasn't one rogue professor making a bad editorial call. This was the norm, the standard. Mid-20th century Australian national history started the clock with European explorers. The story of Australia, as far as official history was concerned, began with white arrival. In 1959, a prominent professor named J.A. Lenours pointed out that Aboriginal Australians appeared in these histories only, and this is his phrase, in a melancholic anthropological footnote. The dominant framing is what historians would later call the cult of forgetfulness. Peaceful settlement, acquiescent natives, a vast, largely empty land that Europeans arrived in and built something from. But this framing wasn't just to make them feel more comfortable, happy. It was because it was legally useful. Because sitting underneath all this doctrine was something called terra nullius, a Latin legal principle meaning the land belonged to no one. No recognised prior ownership, no treaty required, no compensation owed. Terra nullius didn't need to be stated out loud in every history textbook. The silence did the same job. If Aboriginal Australians weren't in the story, how could they make a legal claim? The peaceful settlement story wasn't just a comfortable myth that Australians told themselves. It was how the country was created, grown, and maintained. Remove it, and the legal basis for how the land was held, how sovereignty was claimed, how the entire colonial project was justified, all of it becomes unstable. The science wasn't an oversight, it was a bandage, which is exactly why what happened next was so threatening. Henry Reynolds was a historian at James Cook University in Queensland. In the 1970s, he started doing something that sounds almost mundane. He went to the archives. Colonial newspapers, private letters, government correspondence, sermons, speeches from the frontier era. He worked through libraries and archives across Australia for nearly a decade. And what he was looking for wasn't buried or hidden exactly. It was disaggregated, spread across thousands of individual documents, each one recording a skirmish here, a massacre there, a punitive expedition elsewhere. Nobody else had ever pulled it all together into a single picture before. And so in 1981, he published The Other Side of the Frontier. And in it, he put forward an estimate. It was reasonable to estimate that around 20,000 Aboriginal Australians had been killed by settlers during the outward push of the frontier. 20,000. That's not a small abstract number. That's not just significant violence or tragic conflict. That's a big body count. The reaction was understandably huge. Critics accused Reynolds of unearthing facts that were, and this is a real phrase used at the time, best forgotten. Like, think about that for a second. Best forgotten. Like, not disputed, not wrong, best forgotten. It's like, why do we have to talk about this? It's like, well, because no one has before, and there needs to be a reckoning. Later, during what became known as the History Wars in Australia around the turn of the century, more organised skeptics pushed back, questioning the scale of the fighting and the reliability of the numbers. Reynolds himself acknowledged the challenge, but argued it had been brushed aside by a new generation of scholarship carried out in every part of the country. Here's the thing about Reynolds' number. It didn't matter whether every critic accepted it. What it did, and what couldn't be undone, was force a choice in the heads of every Australian. You either engage with the evidence, or you explicitly argue that 20,000 deaths don't deserve to be part of the national story. And that second position is a lot harder to hold in public than simply never having been asked. The number was out there. And once a number exists, the system that depended on its absence starts to crack. Now we need to go a bit beyond Australia, because what Reynolds exposed wasn't just local to it, it was a design principle all around the world. Colonial land acquisition across the British Empire operated on a legal fiction, that the land was either empty or that its inhabitants had no recognised claim to it under European law. Terra nullius was the Australian expression of this. But the underlying logic was everywhere. The idea that sovereignty could be planted in soil that was, legally speaking, unclaimed. For that kind of fiction to stay in place, the violence required to enforce it had to stay invisible. Not necessarily secret. Many people knew what was happening on the frontier. Government officials received reports. Newspapers ran stories, but none of it was collected centrally. None of it was turned into a number. A number is different. A number is evidence. A number can be entered into a court record, cited in a parliamentary debate, used as the basis for a legal claim. Decentralized violence, like individual incidents, local conflicts, frontier troubles, can be absorbed by the system. It can be framed as exceptional, as mutual, as the inevitable effect of two worlds colliding. But 20,000 deaths on a timeline mapped against the expansion of settlement? That's a pattern, and patterns have causes, and causes have responsible parties. As an alternative to terra nullius that the British had used in Australia, in New Zealand they had the Treaty of Waitangi. This created at least a formal framework for the colonisation. It's imperfect, it's contested, but it's at least documented, and it provides a formal framework for negotiating Indigenous land rights. In Canada, there are a number of treaties covering roughly 40% of the landmass. Australia had none of that. It had terra nullius, which meant it needed its violence to stay uncounted even more than most. Colonial systems don't just depend on taking, they depend on the taking being legally looked at as something other than taking. The moment you count the dead, you introduce evidence that something was defended. And if something was defended, someone owned it. And if someone owned it, terra nullius was never true. That's the legal logic. And by 1992, it made it all the way to the highest court in Australia. 11 years after Reynolds published his estimate, Australia's High Court handed down a judgment that rewrote the country's legal relationship with its own land. It's called the Mabo case, and the language the judges used tells you exactly what had changed. By the way, if you like what you're hearing, consider subscribing so you can catch future ones, plus it helps me out too. The Mabo judgment is named after Eddie Mabo, who was a Torres Strait Islander who had spent a decade arguing in court that his people had never ceded their land, that they had been there continuously, and that the legal fiction of terra nullius was exactly that. A fiction. The High Court agreed. In June 1992, terra nullius was formally overturned in Australian law. But look at the language the two justices used. Justices Dean and Galdron described Australian settlement as a conflagration of oppression and conflict. This is not the language of a court that believes that peaceful settlement occurred. It's the language of a court that has absorbed a decade of revisionist scholarship and is now putting it into the legal record. The judgment explicitly acknowledged the devastation of Aboriginal tribes. It acknowledged conflict. It acknowledged dispossession. The cult of forgetfulness had been replaced in the highest court in the land with an acknowledgement of what the frontier had actually been. And that same year, Prime Minister Paul Keating stood in Redfern, a suburb of Sydney, and gave what is still regarded as one of the most significant speeches in Australian political history. He spoke directly about the murders, the dispossessing, the systematic destruction of communities. Not in vague terms, in specific historical terms. To be clear about what the research shows and doesn't show, there's no documented moment where Reynolds' specific figure of 20,000 was formally entered into a court transcript as Exhibit A. History doesn't usually work that way, or the legal system. What happened was more indirect and arguably more powerful. A decade of scholarship changed what educated Australians, including judges and politicians, understood to be true. It changed the basis that every legal and political argument now had to work against. By 1992, the comfortable story had collapsed, not because of a single dramatic revelation, but because the evidence had accumulated to the point where the fiction required more effort to maintain than to abandon. Reynolds didn't win a court case. He changed what the court was willing to say out loud. But there's something arguably more interesting than all of this that's very easy to miss. Ooh, a rhyme. The question that's easy to skip past is this. Why did it take until 1981 for someone to do what Reynolds did? The archives were nearly always there. The newspapers were always there. The records existed. Why did it take so long? The answer isn't that necessarily no one was lying. It's that there was no mechanism to force the question to be asked. Think about who controlled the historical record in colonial Australia. Government-commissioned histories. University departments funded by institutions that held land under the terms of the legal fiction. School curriculums approved by administrators that had a direct interest in the story of peaceful settlement remaining intact. It may ultimately be a conspiracy, but more importantly, everyone's incentives aligned to this. Nobody needed to sit in a room and agree to suppress the frontier death toll. The people writing the histories simply wrote the histories they were trained to write, in institutions that rewarded certain kinds of questions and didn't fund others. Aboriginal Australians were largely excluded from institutions that produced official knowledge. Their oral histories, their accounts of what had happened on the frontier, these existed, but they existed outside of the frameworks that colonial law recognised. And crucially, anyone who did push back, who did try to document the violence, faced professional and social costs. The reaction to Reynolds' work, like Best Forgotten, tells you what the informal enforcement looked like. Not imprisonment, just delegitimization. just the signal that this kind of work was uncomfortable rather than important. The system didn't necessarily need to actively suppress the truth, because there are plenty of sources out there that anyone could have looked at. It just needed to make counting the dead feel like bad manners. That's the mechanism, not necessarily malice. The colonial system produced historians who didn't ask the question, trained in institutions that didn't fund the question, working in a culture that treated the question as impolite. It wasn't necessarily always a conspiracy. It was a high-level summary with the inconvenient data ignored. Which brings us to what Reynolds' act of counting actually was, and why it mattered beyond Australia. So here's something that kind of reframes everything we've just covered. Reynolds didn't discover the frontier violence. Settlers knew about it. Governors knew about it. Newspapers reported on it. The violence was acknowledged in vague, dispersed, unconnected terms for the entire history of Australian settlement. What Reynolds did wasn't uncover a secret. He aggregated it. He turned a variety of almost individual facts into a cohesive story, into a single, citable, politically usable number. And that act, the act of counting, is what changed everything. Not because 20,000 is a magic number, but because a number forces a different kind of response than a feeling. You can say, yes, it's complicated, or I don't really understand what's going on there, like people do with Israel, and move on. You cannot do that with a body count, although arguably Israel does that. A body count almost demands that we ask, who killed them? Under what authority? On whose land? With what legal justification? When you start asking those questions with a number attached, feed directly into land back for Aboriginal people, into compensation debates, into constitutional recognition campaigns, into the language that High Court justices use when they're willing to say unutterable shame on the record. Think about where that logic goes next. Every colonial system that's still standing, every land settlement, every resource extraction arrangement, every border drawn by a foreign power, depends on some version of the same thing, a cost that's been acknowledged in vague terms but never combined into something a court can or will use. In most cases, the question isn't whether the harm happened, it's whether anyone's done anything to make it easily understandable yet. Reynolds sat down in an archive and counted the dead, and that act, not a revolution, not a war, not even a court case, that act made the legal fiction of peaceful settlement impossible to maintain, because here's how colonial systems actually run. Not just on land, not just on labour, not just on resources. They run on the gap between what happened and what's been measured. Close that gap and the system has to answer for itself someday. The number was always there. Someone just had to write it down. So yeah, Australia tried its best to forget the 20,000 dead Aboriginal people until it couldn't. But there are cases in history where governments look to inflate the body count when they need to make the other side look like monsters. Take a look at this to see why Britain inflated the death count by 40 times to get the response it needed in Ireland in 1641. And if you're still here, maybe consider a like, subscribe, maybe even a hype. I don't know, do what you want. And yeah, bye. National Legacy of an definite free textbook in Australia. The question that's easy to... The question